More now on the election. It'll all soon be over. General election 2024 will have come and gone. Some of you may breathe a sigh of relief that political campaigning has come to an end. There'll be no more political flyers coming through your letterbox on the way to the bin. And on programmes like this, there will be fewer politicians making promises they can't or won't keep. Some of you might miss it, perhaps. But voting or choosing not to vote is a right that we sometimes take for granted. It's a privilege that many people in many countries around the world do not enjoy. Now, perhaps I'm being too nostalgic and doughy-eyed about democracy. Is it all what it's cracked up to? Does it really matter? If we vote tomorrow, well, Alan Renwick is a professor of democratic politics at UCL who jointly published a report last year entitled The Future of Democracy in the UK. Alan, welcome to the programme.
Thanks very much, Wyre.
Does it matter if we vote tomorrow, really?
Oh, yes, definitely it does. I mean, having democracy is really important. In a democracy, we are freer, we have more control over our own lives. Might not feel it terribly much all the time, but, being in a democracy is a fantastic thing. We're more prosperous in a democracy than in a non-democracy as well. And actually, I think most people do recognise that. So we did a survey a couple of years ago in that report that you mentioned there, and only 3% of people in response to a question that we asked said that they thought democracy is not the best form of government. So I think most people do recognise that democracy is a good thing. But at the same time, most people are, as your introduction there has indicated, are really dissatisfied with the state of our democracy in the UK at the moment. And I think, it's perfectly fair to want our democracy to function better than it is working at the moment.
One thing we repeatedly hear is that people don't trust politicians. Well, what can they, and perhaps we as messengers, do to try and remedy that, and in that also make sure that more people turn out to vote?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. Most people have very low trust in politicians. And the main reason for that is that people just see politicians as being dishonest. And, that's partly a perception that politicians sometimes lie. And it's true that sometimes politicians do lie. But it's also wider than that. It's also just, politicians not answering the question, trying to evade, trying to give half answers, spinning to give the most positive take on things all of the time. So if we wanted to improve trust in our democracy, then at least one very important thing would be for politicians to change the nature of how they speak with us and to speak more honestly. But that's not an easy thing to call for. And if we're looking at this from the point of view of politicians, they're thinking, imagine you've got a politician who really cares about the country and doing the best for the country. They need power in order to be able to do good. And in order to gain power, they need to win our votes. But they know that if they spoke completely honestly, they would win fewer votes than they win if they speak in the kinds of very convoluted ways that often they speak at the moment. Because if they spoke the whole complex truth, which always has good bits and bad bits, then their opponents and the bits of the media that don't like them would pick out the bad bits and just focus on those and ram those through very hard.
What about about our responsibilities as voters? What right do we have to complain when many of us don't even turn out to vote? What about compulsory voting, for example?
Yeah, I think there's a good case for compulsory voting. I think we do have a duty in our democracy to the community as a whole. Democracy is something that is good for the community as a whole, and we depend on our fellow citizens to take part in democracy. At the same time, I think just making voting compulsory, it's kind of a very negative way of doing things. It's using a stick rather than a carrot. And I think we ought to be trying to find ways to make people want to vote more rather than just going to that kind of negative lever first of all. So, I think things like improving education about politics, doing things in order to try to create more space. And this is something that the media could be very much thinking about, more space in which we can have more kind of thoughtful, considered conversations about political issues. These are the sorts of things that I would try to do first before just going to that more negative policy instrument of introducing compulsory voting.
Fantastic stuff. And of course, there is more information about tomorrow's election on the BBC News website. But that's Alan Renwick, Professor of Democratic Politics at UCL and the author of a report called The Future of Democracy in the UK.